Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Georgian President Salome Zourabichvili has left the Orbeliani Palace and the presidential seat after a hardline critic of the West Mikheil Kavelashvili was sworn in as her successor amid widespread public protests. Speaking to protesters gathered outside her official residence in Tbilisi, she described the inauguration as a parody and said, "I will leave from here, I will come to you, and I will be with you." So where does Georgia go to now? Has Putin managed to thwart EU membership for the country? Well, to explore these and other questions, I am joined by Professor Scott Lucas, University College Dublin. Professor Lucas, welcome back to TVP World. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me here.
Okay, so talk us through your understanding of the timeline here. The influence of Russia, the undermining of the electoral process, and the response to the demonstrators on the streets of Tbilisi and other cities in Georgia.
I mean, we could go back years to talk about the debate in Georgia about political space and about the legitimacy of government. We could talk about earlier this year, for example, the disputes around the so-called foreign agents bills, in which the ruling Georgia Dream Party was accused of trying to crush or suppress dissent. But the immediate context for this are this autumn's elections, in which on the face of it, the Georgian Dream Party, this ruling party, which some have said is pro-Russian or leans towards Russia, official count showed that they had a majority of the votes and they formed effectively the next government. Now, critics of that vote say it was not legitimate, that in fact, Georgian Dream's Party founder, Orbeliani Palace, had been the channel through which a lot of Moscow's money, millions of euros, were funneled into Georgia to tilt the election. This dispute over the legitimacy of the election, including international groups who have disputed it, it continues. But Georgia Dream, at least for the moment, holding parliament, they get to choose the president. Now, when they went through choosing the president, it was a show confirmation because all the opposition parties effectively boycotted. They chose as president a former footballer who played in England, Mr. Kavelashvili. He has been a longtime ally of Georgian Dream. He is a far-right politician. He's who they want in the presidency. But of course, for the protesters and for the former president, Miss Zourabichvili, they see a threat to democracy. They see a threat to political space, which is continuing, in part because of internal politics and what Georgian Dream represents, but in part because of Russian influence.
Okay, so let's just pick that apart a little bit. Georgian Dream were, from initially at least, very pro-EU accession. And a lot has been said about the Russian influence. How sure are we that there has been Russian influence and that the funnel, if you like, for that into Georgian politics has been this oligarch?
Well, certainly we have other cases that we can discuss as well, where we have a pretty good idea of the Russian attempts to, let's say, influence elections. We have the recent example of Moldova, for example, where the Moldovan authorities say that you could be talking up to 30 million euros that were funneled into the country to try to influence the vote for the presidency and also the vote in the referendum regarding accession to the European Union. We have accusations recently that Russia was behind the surprise candidacy of a hard right figure, a man who was not really known beyond TikTok videos and whose victory in the presidency has been annulled by the courts in Romania because of this suspected external influence. In the case of Georgia, we don't have the hard proof yet. In other words, we don't absolutely have all the money, have all the briefcases, have all the attempts to buy votes, which are documented. But it is very clear that the founder of Georgian Dream, Mr. Ivanishvili, who made his fortune in Russia, who is very close to the Kremlin, let's put it this way. If Russia wanted to influence the elections, they have a channel to do so, but they didn't necessarily have to do so. This man is wealthy enough that having made his career in Russia, he could put his thumbs on the scales. And that is compounded by the fact of the accusations that Georgian Dream did not allow a full and fair account over the election, that the official results were in fact massaged to ensure that they got a majority.
Understood. Well, you certainly paint a picture of a very dodgy election altogether. Now, Georgian Dream seem kind of dead set on going ahead, ignoring the protests on the streets, which have been peaceful and have been going on for about 30 days. Is there any more that the populace can do to move the needle?
Well, I think with protests like this, it's always a question of the persistence of the protest and whether they continue. I'll give you a context, which is that the cause for this protest is certainly going to remain, because one of the first actions that Georgian Dream took after getting the parliamentary majority was to effectively shelve any talks of joining the EU until 2028. Now, they claim this has nothing to do with Russia or Russian pressure, but of course, for those people who are critics of them, they will see this as serving Moscow's interest. Now, if the protests are motivated by that and by other issues, such as the call for political participation to proceed day by day by day, we get into a situation where the question of legitimacy is always there. And I will dare to give you a parallel where there are some similarities and some important differences. The protests in Ukraine in 2013, which in part were triggered by political repression and in part were triggered by the question of Ukraine's relationship to the EU, they started in November. Now, they did not immediately remove President Yanukovych. He did not flee the country until March, 4 months later. But it was a sign that ongoing protest can undermine the legitimacy of a ruling party. In the case of Ukraine, I think perhaps, however, the key difference up to this point is that Yanukovych effectively ordered the security forces to fire on the protesters. And it was that resort to bloodshed that I think eventually pushed him out of office. So far, Georgian Dream is not doing that. And we have to emphasize this. This is still a nonviolent situation on both sides. And so I think we're looking at a protracted situation, almost a political stalemate, even if Georgian Dream continues to be the party that is nominally in power.
Understood. But again, if I may highlight another difference between the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which is what I believe you're referring to, and Georgia, is that in Ukraine there was a huge population of foreign dignitaries, foreign students and so on, standing side by side with the protesters. We're not seeing so much of that in Georgia. Should we be?
Well, I think the Georgian opposition, if you have the chance to interview them, would say, look, we don't really want this to be seen as, foreign students or foreign actors who are here. We want it to be seen as very much a Georgian movement. Now, certainly, I think they appreciate expressions of solidarity and support from outside the country. But I think the idea that you need to have foreigners on the streets of Tbilisi to make this a turning point, I don't necessarily buy into that. Now, I think what you're indicating is, of course, that does mean that you could be talking about a much more protracted effort in the sense that Georgia is not getting the international attention that Ukraine got. Your station is an exception, of course, but I think for many European, U.S. outlets, Georgia is a case they know very little about. That's why I say that there are many moving parts here. But I would say the one I am watching is that if you have a former president in Ms. Zourabichvili, who has been prominent in calling for this nonviolent opposition, who did not insist on staying in the presidential office yesterday, who came out, but who rallied with the protesters at that point, you have the potential leader in her of an opposition movement. And if that opposition movement finds cohesion, where it's not just in Tbilisi, but in other Georgian cities and outside the cities, then you may have something which is a lasting issue for this government, for Georgian Dream, because those protesters will not melt away.
Understood. So a focused movement with momentum under a leader. I'd just like to change tack, excuse me, just the last minute or so that we have left, Professor. Now, as we've been reporting, Ukraine is no longer going to carry Russian gas across its territory from the 1st of January, and this is going to affect Slovakia. And in return, Slovakia has said that it will stop electricity supplies to Ukraine. Now, Poland has said that they will step in to support electricity supplies for Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine's faced with the additional problem that its energy infrastructure has been so largely destroyed by Russian bombing. How do you see that dynamic play out?
Well, let's start off, first of all, by identifying what has happened in the past few days. And that is the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico, as you mentioned, having gone to Moscow and met Vladimir Putin, came back with what was effectively this ultimatum to Ukraine, which is continue to allow the Russian state company Gazprom to transit gas across your country, or we will cut off electricity exports to you. Ukraine's response has been, through President Zelensky last night in an address to the nation, we will not give in to this blackmail, and we believe we have support from outside. We have support from countries such as Poland and others in Europe to give us an assurance of electricity. Now, of course, as you mentioned, the Russian attacks will continue. But at this point, I think you're seeing resistance of this Slovakian ultimatum and effectively Moscow's ultimatum. And what will be interesting is whether Slovakia effectively steps back from this. I must emphasize that the Ukrainian position, and indeed that of the Europeans, is that Slovakia had months to prepare for this transit of Russian gas to be halted. Other countries, including Hungary, for example, including the Czech Republic, have arranged for alternative supplies. So if Slovakia is in a difficult position under Mr. Fico, that's on his back. It shouldn't be something which is used to punish the Ukrainians.
Right.
The question of whether European solidarity stands behind Kyiv at this point.
Understood. Well, Professor, thank you very much indeed for your analysis. And I wish you a very happy New Year. Good night.
The very best to you and your viewers.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And that's all from us this episode of World Talks. Don't go away. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.